Yo, welcome to the Noob and the Knower. In this podcast, we pair a driven beginner with a seasoned vet to explain how to learn basically anything.
This season's anything is how to fly fish. Stick around as we cover the gamut, 101 to the 401, gear, reading water, fishing techniques, and much, much more.
With star of hit video series Modern Nymphing, Fly Fishing Team USA medalist, and professional guide Lance Egan.
That's right. And here co-hosting and asking the questions on your behalf is avid fly fisher and recently graduated noob, Pablo Signori.
So let's go. Together we'll take you from fishing zero
to fly angling hero faster than you can say, fish on.
Here we are. Welcome, everybody. This is the Noob and the Knower, Fly Fishing Edition, Season 1, Episode 1, Epicness. I'm here with Lance Egan, who is going to be my co-host. I am Pablo Signori. What's going on, Lance? How are you?
I'm pretty good, man. How are you?
Oh, I'm super juiced. So excited to finally be doing this with you. Very grateful because it's been a long journey. Lots of people involved. We also have Mr. Ray Blay behind me. Manager of the Chicago fly fishing store Orvis, and also a fishing extraordinaire. He's got the Jedi bug, if you will.
Ray.
Mr. Ray. He doesn't have a mic. I might have to get him a mic because it's just not fair. Let's get down to business here. So I just wanted to kind of point out what the objective is with this podcast, because I think the Noob and the Knower kind of explains a little bit. We've taken someone who doesn't know a lot, and we've paired them with someone who has a lot of knowledge on a certain subject. And we're going to be doing this on the subject of fly fishing and pretty in depth. But this particular series is a how-to. And it's basically taking you from knowing nothing in fly fishing, never even touching a rod, and getting you on the water, catching fish, and consistently. So it's kind of a lofty goal. But the reason it's so important to do is because I, as a noob, I've kind of recently graduated, but when I first started, there was no resource like this for me, and it was very frustrating. So I was scouring the internet trying to find out how to do this, how to fly fish, and there's so much information that it was like inundating, and it was really difficult to kind of focus my thought and figure out what is the right or wrong way to do. And what I realized is like there's actually a lot of leeway in most of the stuff that we do in fly fishing. So that's the purpose of this podcast. We're going to start you from never having a rod to catching fish. A big part of us getting there is going to be Mr. Lance Egan, the legend of a fly fisher. I know that you know all the things you've done, but I have a little short synopsis of why you are a demigod in the sport.
Well, I'm not, but I do like to fish.
Part of why we love this guy is because he is so humble, and it's a beautiful thing. I think that. But this man, I mean, he just has such a catalog of work, and most of his work is winning championships. The guy is a 3-time national fly fishing champion. He's made it to the World Fly Fishing Championship 13 times and is a 3 times over World Fly Fishing Championship medalist. It's actually hard to say because there's so much going on with his accolades. He has also placed in the top 2 8 times in fly casting championships. You also have some serious video action where you are on a screen catching a lot of fish on cue. It's very impressive, and now it's our job to get our listeners there. Would you agree?
Absolutely, yeah. It's a great opportunity to share, our passion and the thing that we love to do, which is fly fishing, and try and share some of that knowledge with the listeners and hopefully help them catch a few more fish along the way.
If they follow the guidance, they will. We are not going to leave mostly any stones unturned.
We're going to get in there, down to the nitty gritty.
Exactly. Okay, so first things first. Okay, I really want to start this from literally zero. So my first question in my notes here is, what is fishing? Okay, I looked up a definition. This is what it says online.
This is Pisces Varies, an NATK segment where I, Jen Ripple, define fishy words for you. Boom!
Fishing. Verb. Fishing is the activity of trying to catch fish. Fish are often caught in the wild, but may also be caught from stocked bodies of water. Techniques for catching fish include hand gathering, spearing, angling, and trapping. Example in context.
Dude, I feel like you're a better angler than me.
Oh my God, just stop. You are obviously just fishing.
So I thought that was a pretty good definition. I think that's true.
Yeah, absolutely. Just a way to capture fish, right?
And there's a multitude of reasons why you would fish. In the fly fishing world, And we'll get to the culture of it later, but a lot of it is kind of catch and release. So you do it for the sport of catching the fish and for admiring its beauty. But you can also catch fish to eat, right? Which is what probably most people do, definitely in the commercial realm of fishing. But so fly fishing is really just a sect of fishing, right?
Yeah. And like you say, it'd be less common in fly fishing to keep fish. Some people do still, but I would say it's the exception. Very, very few fly anglers are keeping any fish versus with conventional gear. Depending on what you're chasing, there's a lot of bass anglers and musky anglers and things that are releasing a lot of fish. But a lot of folks that are chasing trout with spinning gear or salmon, a lot of saltwater anglers are fishing for food, right? They're trying to catch something they can eat.
This reminds me of a quick anecdotal story.
Oh, no.
My family's from Argentina, and my wife is too, and my brother-in-law is as well. And in Argentina, it's very much the culture is you catch fish to eat them. And so I was trying to get him into fly fishing, and he was like, I just don't understand. Like, why would you catch a fish and release it? That's so cruel. Because a lot of people do think that it is cruel, and we're not going to get into the ethics of all this right now. But my response to him was, don't you think the fish is happier that we didn't kill it and eat it and it gets to swim freely and have a great time for the rest of its day? And he was like, that's an interesting prospect.
Never thought of it that way, yeah. Would you rather be dead or just have a slight piercing with a barbless hook and then left to go swim again,
Exactly.
I'll take the latter.
So, that's part of how I've rationalized it for myself.
Sure.
But most of what we do in the fly fishing realm is catching the fish for sport and usually releasing the fish. But I guess we should not really go down that road right now. Let's kind of continue on. The first question was, what is fishing? Second question is, what is fly fishing? And so I also looked up the definition online for fly fishing.
Pisces, berries, boom.
Fly fishing. Verb. Fly fishing is an angling method that uses a lightweight lure called an artificial fly to catch fish. The fly is cast using a fly rod, fly reel, and specialized weighted line. The light weight requires casting techniques significantly different from other forms of casting.
Example in context.
I used to love casting from atop a helicopter until my line got caught in the rotor blade and I went fly fishing.
So this is kind of interesting because now I think the scope of fly fishing is kind of broadened a bit from this definition, but you're the expert. I'm the noob, so maybe you can weigh in on that. How would you define fly fishing?
Yeah, fly fishing to me is using an artificial fly with a fly rod, a fly reel, and a fly line. As you said, those waters can get a little murky, and that, like, I would consider tenkara fishing a style of fly fishing. It's different. That's why they call it tenkara, but you're still using an artificial fly. You're, however, not using a fly reel and fly line.
Let me pause you there. Just for our listeners, tenkara fishing is kind of a subgenre of fly fishing that came out of Japan that has been popular in the last 5 to 6 years. And eventually we'll probably do a bonus podcast on tenkara fishing. Sorry, go ahead.
You're all right. And it's probably worth noting that it's been done for, I think, thousands of years. I don't know exactly how long, but it's been popularized in the U.S. the last 5 to 10 years, but it's been happening a lot longer than we've been a country.
Right. The long cane fishing.
Right.
It's kind of like the original way to fish, right?
Exactly. You could further muddy these waters by, what let's call it popular technique lately is European style nymphing, right? Some people call it tight lining. Some people call it high sticking. You can call it whatever you want. We call it Euro nymphing because the Euros kind of perfected it, I would argue, but it uses a fly line, but it uses a thin fly line, and you're not necessarily using that fly line to load the rod, which you are oftentimes with more traditional fly casting. That said, when you're nymph fishing, in most cases, you're really not loading the rod much with a fly line. You've got enough weight on there, whether you're using an indicator rig and we're getting off on tangents here that we're going to cover in this podcast. So if you don't know what we're talking about, don't worry, there's more to come. But
yeah, I was just going to say, this might be too heavy for the noob.
But there are lots of ways to fish a fly, and certainly, at its core, fly fishing generally is going to use an artificial fly, fly rod, fly reel, fly line.
He mentioned European style fishing. It should be noted, and of course we will do a podcast or several on that subject, but it should be noted that Lance is one of the pioneers of that style of fly fishing, at least as it's known in this country, and he continues to be a progressive innovator of that style here, which has now become basically ubiquitous in the last, I would say, 3 years, 4 years maybe?
Yeah, it's been coming along steady for about 15 years, but it's really grown very, very quickly in the last 3 to 5, let's say.
Okay, but anyways, if you don't know anything about fly fishing, everything we just said is probably going to be very confusing and it might put you off. So the real important thing to note is that we use what's called a fly, but the fly has nothing to do with the insect fly. Sometimes there are flies that look like insects, but this is a very common mistake that people make or assume. They assume that the fly is actually a fly. And
like a house fly, you're talking.
Yeah, exactly. But really a fly is anything that's at the end of your fly line, leader, and tippet, which we'll talk about later. But the line that comes from your reel to the end, whatever's on the end of that is a fly.
Yeah, I think it's worth noting that, like you're saying, a fly could be many things. It could be very imitative. It could imitate particular species that you find in a river or lake. It could also imitate
species of
insects, like a mayfly, a caddis, a stonefly, and on. It could also be a streamer, we call them in fly fishing, that would oftentimes imitate more of a minnow or possibly a crayfish, something that would be more animated and swimming versus a more standard fly would be something that would be most of the time at the mercy of the current or able to swim but very slowly. You have different types of flies. If you, at the core of all these, basically for trout fishing, which is the most common type of fly fishing, you have dry flies that float, wet flies or nymphs that are designed to sink, and streamers that are designed to sink. Those would be very basic categories.
Okay, so let me ask you this to kind of bring this back to what we were trying to figure out, which was, what is fishing? What is fly fishing? So now, how is fly fishing different from spin fishing, which would be what everyone knows as this hey, I just bought a fishing pole. You bought some sort of spinning gear. Mm-hmm. How is a fly different from bait?
A fly is different than bait several ways. Bait is usually scented, right? But you could have an artificial lure, let's call it, that some people would call baits, in bass fishing world, a spinner bait, a crank bait, that sort of thing. But those don't necessarily have scent. To me, the biggest differentiator between fly fishing and conventional fishing, if you will, is that conventional fishing, whether you're using a spin cast or a bait casting style reel or a trolling reels, you're letting line out to get line off the reel. With spin cast or bait casting, the lure or the weight that you have on the end of your line is pulling line off the reel. And in fly fishing, the weight you're casting is actually the fly line, because the flies are generally very small and virtually weightless. They don't have enough mass, enough weight to carry your line with them. So the way that you're actually propelling that fly, that imitation, through the air is with the mass of the fly line carrying that artificial fly with it. It's a very different casting process using fly tackle versus conventional gear.
Okay, that was a really profound way of saying it for me, because I think that you really explained it well, and it's a hard thing to explain. I always try and think of analogies like, okay, let's say you have an empty tin bucket and you're trying to get it from here to there. You're going to kick it, 5 feet, and you have this very, very light fishing line on that. Well, if you kick the bucket, it's going to drag that line out with you. That's traditional, just normal fishing. Now, let's say you have a chain on that bucket that weighs 20 pounds. If you kick the bucket's not going anywhere.
Right.
But if you pick up that chain and you whip that thing out there, it's going to take the bucket with it. And that's kind of the concept of fly fishing, is we're actually using the chain to get the bucket out there.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Absolutely. Think of it this way too. If you had, most spinning tackle is you're casting a lure that has weight. Most lures are sold in weights, 1/8 ounce, 1/4 ounce, 1/2 ounce, 3/8, and so on. In fly fishing, you have a tiny fly. We talk about hook sizes. To those of that are fly fish, they're going to know, like a 14 hook, what that is. If you've not fly fished before, a 14 hook, I'd have to measure it. I don't know, but off the top of my head, it's not even a 1/2 inch long, right? And it's just
it's like the length of your fingernail.
Right. It's got feathers and fluff on it. So you could hand a size 14 fly to Nolan Ryan, who is, I'm not a baseball guy, but I know who Nolan Ryan is, right? He's a baseball pitcher. He couldn't throw a size 14 fly like 3 feet because there's no weight, there's no mass to it. But he could throw a Rapala, a lure, a jig,
totally
30, 40, maybe 100 feet, depending on how heavy it is. So you have to wrap your mind around how the tools you're using are designed to cast something that's virtually weightless versus something that's got a lot of weight to it.
Okay, so you just said an important word there, which is tools. So now let's talk about these tools. I'm assuming you're talking about the rod, right?
The rod and the line, yes.
Okay, so let's start with the rod, then we'll talk about the line. how is a rod that is used for fly fishing different from traditional fishing?
Well, generally speaking, they're longer and they're softer. They're by softer, I mean they flex more, they bend more, but they're really not very different, except that fly rods are, because they're designed to cast a lighter weight, overall, the fly line, again, being your weight, they tend to have a deeper flex, a deeper bend in the rod. So a spinning rod or a bait casting rod, because it's going to be designed, again, they come in different actions, in spinning tackle, you could buy at ultralight, a light, a medium, and on and on. If you're going to cast a really large bait on a spinning rod, you would need maybe a medium heavy or a heavy rod. And if you're going to toss a tiny little 64th ounce jig, you probably want an ultralight. And in fly fishing, it's actually very similar. They're designed to both propel weight through the air. It's just that we're talking about weight in grains instead of ounces. In fly fishing, fly lines are measured in a grain weight, which is incredibly light. The most common fly rod is a 5-weight rod, and it's designed to cast 140 grain fly line. So 140 grains, I don't even know what that is in ounces, but it's not very much weight. It's very, very light. So the fly rod has to have a lot more flex, a lot more deeper bend, and it's easier to get bend on a longer rod. So that most fly rods tend to be, 7.5 feet on the really short end of things, and up into 10, 11 feet on single-handed rods, and maybe 11 to 14, 15 feet on two-handed rods.
And that bend is important because that's kind of what makes that kinetic energy, right? It's like a catapult. It kind of bends the whole thing, and so that you can shoot it out the other way, right?
Yeah, they're both styles, whether you're talking spinning or bait casting and fly, they're designed to cast weight. So the spinning rod is loaded with the weight of the lure, the fly rod is loaded with the weight of the line, but they both have to have enough bend to propel that line and or lure through the air to your desired target.
So we know now that the rods typically are longer, they're lighter, they're designed to move less weight, basically. And that's because of the fly line. The fly line is actually where the weight is and not the lure or what we call the fly.
Correct.
So now let's talk about reels, because I feel like in traditional fishing, the reel is really what kind of defines the whole thing. And there's a few different styles of them. How important is the reel in fly fishing?
Well, it depends on what you're chasing. For saltwater use or large fish, a quality reel is very important because you need a reel that's capable of slowing down a powerful running fish, a fish that's hooked and then is fighting. If you're hooking tarpon in saltwater, they're going to tax your reel a lot more than, say, a 12-inch trout in a stream, right? But reels are important because they need to hold the line. They need to be able to hold it comfortably, have enough capacity to hold the line and still operate, and then ideally have a little bit of room for what we call backing, which in fly fishing is kind of your insurance policy. It's a less expensive, thinner diameter line, usually made of Dacron, that goes on the bottom of the reel spool, and then you connect that to your fly line, which is the weighted part of the line that you're casting, and the reel needs to hold all of that, and then obviously needs to be able to have line removed and then take line back up onto the reel when you're fighting a fish or when you're ready to head home for the day or what have you. So the reels, they vary a lot in quality, they vary a lot in price, but for most trout fishers, which again is what most fly fishers are doing, the reel is important that it doesn't just all of a sudden fall apart on you, but outside of that, it really just needs to hold some line. There are lots of design, features we could talk about as far as advantages, but at the core of it, it's a line holder.
Okay. So, and that's very different from spin fishing. There's also more mechanisms in spin fishing. I keep calling it spin fishing, but I guess I should just call it traditional fishing. I don't know.
Yeah, that means spin fishing. I think most people know what you're talking about with a spinning reel.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
The Zebco one?
The Zebco.
But what's interesting about those reels is that they have a mechanism on them that locks the line. So once you cast out, you click the thing, whatever it might be. If it's a spinning reel, you flop over the bail on it. Mm-hmm. Or if it's a Zebco, it's the little button you press. Those things stop the line from coming out if a fish takes, and you can set your drag, which is kind of how much pounds you're keeping the force against what's taking the line off the reel if you catch a big fish. Mm-hmm. But with fly fishing, I almost feel and I've used this analogy before, I don't know if it's good or bad, but I feel like it's almost like bow hunting versus rifle hunting when it comes to catching fish, because it is more primitive in a way where you're just using your hands to catch a fish. It's the fish takes your fly and then you're fighting the fish with your hand. You're holding the line. It's not the reel that's holding your line when you're fighting the fish, unless they go on a run and then they're on your reel. But otherwise, you're bringing the fish in by pulling the line towards you, with your other hand.
I'm with you there. The fly fishing, fly rods being generally a little softer in action, again, bending and flexing a bit more. And then oftentimes you're fighting a fish by hand. I would argue that fly fishing is maybe a little bit more tactile. You're feeling the fish fight a bit more. You're handling the line with your fingers oftentimes instead of just a reel handle and a rod on the other hand. But yeah, for sure, it's slightly different that way as far as how you're fighting the fish. The drags can still apply. Like you said, if you have a big fish in fly fishing that takes the line you have out, you could still play it off the reel and then the drag can come into play. Oftentimes with trout fishing, that's not usually the case. It's more often that you're just hooking a fish and then playing it by stripping in line or slipping a little bit of line when the fish wants to run, but they often don't run far enough away that you have to put the fish on the reel.
Okay, yeah. And for the noobs, stripping in line means pulling in line with your other hand that's not holding the rod. Okay?
Thank you. It does not mean removing clothing while you're on the river.
Well, it can, but
I wouldn't recommend it.
But it also means this. Okay, well, here's a question for you that could be highly contentious, but are there times when one is better than the other as far as spinning versus fly fishing? I can think of one, but I'm going to let the expert answer.
Well, I'd love to hear your take too, but yeah, I think there are times where both can be advantageous, right? I'm a believer. I fly fish probably 99% of the time, but I'm a type of guy that also has ice fishing setups and spinning rods and full setups of spinning and casting rods. And there are definitely times and for certain species and techniques that it's a huge advantage to be able to fish, conventional gear over fly fishing, jigging really deep or getting any sort of bait or lure or anything really deep. Fly tackle only gets so deep,
That was what I would have said. Anytime you have to fish past 20 feet maybe?
Yeah, I mean, you can get fly lines down farther than that, but comfortably I'm with you, 25, 30 feet. Beyond that, you're starting to get beyond where fly fishing is comfortable to do. You can get lines that will sink farther than that, but they're not very fun to cast and on and on. So there's definitely times and places where, each is an advantage. On the flip side of things, fly fishing, when you have trout that are selectively feeding on hatching insects, aquatic insects in a river, whether they're mayflies, midges, caddis, doesn't really matter, and they're carefully sipping these emerging insects off the surface of the water, there isn't really a great way to get a fly to them with conventional gear. You can do a spinning rod with a fly in a bubble is a popular way out west here, but that bubble, to be able to cast again, has to have a lot of weight to it. So usually most people use a water-filled bubble, and when that water-filled bubble hits the water, it sends every fish within about 10 or 15 feet running for its life because that impact hitting the water scares them. So can you catch fish that way? Absolutely. Is it the most efficient way to do it? No way. Where, again, fishing really deep, there's advantages, and there's all kinds of, we could go into, we could make 10 podcasts about just the differences in techniques that are more advantageous for each situation. But generally speaking, I think most people fly fish because they really like it. It's a challenge. Like you said, it's kind of archery hunting versus rifle hunting. You could go into any trout lake and throw a jig or a lure much farther than most people can cast a fly, right?
Right.
And cover more water. It doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work better, but there could be some advantages to it. On the flip side, it's sometimes just really fun. Let's be honest, there's a lot of folks in parts of the country that don't have great fishing near them that love to fly cast. California, for instance, has lots of fishing, but California also has a whole bunch of population centers where there's not a lot of great fishing nearby, and they have casting clubs where there's a whole bunch of people that are just into casting and really don't fish that much. Fly casting is really fun to do just in and of itself.
For a long time, I was like, if I don't catch a fish, I don't care. I just enjoy casting. And actually here in Chicago, we have, I think it's the country's oldest casting pond. Isn't that correct?
Oh, cool.
Country's oldest casting pond. It's called North Pond. Built for the World's Fair. Ray.
Oh,
there you
cool.
go.
There you
Everybody,
go.
Ray Blay.
It's Ray Ray.
Mr. Ray Ray.
Ray Ray dropping knowledge. Yeah.
Dropping knowledge.
In Utah, where I live, we don't have any casting clubs, I think, because most people just go fishing. There's
Right.
not too much outside of for fly fishing anyway. There's plenty of fly fishing to do and no casting ponds.
And now, a word from our sponsors.
From the vise to the boat, to the bank, to those moments you connect to a fish, Loon Outdoors is with you every step of the way with tools designed at the bench and on the water to help make your best day on the water better.
Well, let's continue on here. So another aspect of fly fishing that I noticed is very different. And, I know the answers to a lot of these questions, but I'm asking them because they were the questions that I had when I first started.
Sure.
It might seem silly that I'm asking these questions because at this point I've done a lot of fishing, but that's the whole purpose of the show. So I just want to clarify that.
Yeah, I think everybody realizes that you're asking questions. You're being dumbed down here to ask questions to try and help everybody else learn, right?
Well, I mean, it's not. I don't know that much. I want to learn, and so this is helping me also. But I wanted to just put out there that it's like there's a way of thinking about this that I think is missing out there, and so that's what I'm bringing to the show is that kind of noob perspective. And so one of the things that I remember asking myself was, okay, well, I see all these fly fishermen, and they're standing in the river with these things on, which are called waders. And I'm like, you don't really see that many traditional fishermen doing that. Most of them are like fishing from the bank. I think that's like the most traditional thing you see is like someone in a chair on the bank. They have like their worms beside them. I actually saw on Instagram an ad for a rod holder that it straps onto your calf and you just plop your rod right into that thing so you can sit in your chair comfortably and not have to hold your rod. It seems like fly fishing is much more active and you're like standing in a river and all these things. Is that true? And why? Why is that?
I think there's several things there. Really, I think the main player with having waders is just getting in the river is with fly fishing, especially in river fishing, your positioning in the river is really key. It's not going to make a lot of sense to those that haven't fished before, but fly fished before, I should say. But without getting too technical, there's a term in fly fishing we call drag that is not what you would see in Vegas. It's influence that conflicting currents place on your rig. So if you were to lay a cast out in the river, generally speaking, the river bank to bank is not moving the exact same speed, from one bank to the other. It has slower water near the bank, your near bank, slower water near the far bank. Usually somewhere in there, often in the middle of the river, it's moving a bit faster. If it has rocks or logs or obstructions to the flow, it could have drastic changes in speed. And so imagine laying a cast out there 30 feet, 25, 30, 35 feet away, and your fly line lands with all these conflicting currents contacting the fly line and the leader, and your fly that you're trying to get to drift the exact same speed as the current where you're trying to fish, where you think that fish is laying in the river, all of a sudden gets pulled sideways or gets pulled downstream faster than the current it's currently in. Current, there's too many currents there, but you know what I mean? You know what I mean? Currently, I'm using too much current words. But I think hopefully the listeners can paint that picture a little bit. You get, what happens is your fly drifts quicker than the current that it's in. And that's what we call drag because it's dragging your fly faster than the surface that it would normally be in. So a natural insect would be at the mercy of that current speed. It wouldn't be influenced by anything else. But because our fly is tethered to us, it gets influenced by all those conflicting currents.
Right. So being in the river in the right position is what helps you combat drag.
That's the long-winded way of saying being able to move, having waders and boots on allows you to move in and out of the river and change banks, cross the river, change angles so that you can most easily get the best drift and the best presentation possible for your fly to get a natural drift.
Yeah, and I would also add to that I think a lot of times, depending on the size of the river, obviously, but if it's a very large river, with a traditional rod, especially if you put something very heavy on the end, you can just launch that thing super far. Mm-hmm. And maybe, you've won fly casting competitions, so maybe you don't fit in this circle, but most people can't cast that far, and getting in the river kind of helps them get closer to fish along with presentation.
Right.
It gives them access to more parts of the river, I guess I should say.
Totally. And to add one more thing, whether you're on a river or a lake, when you're fly casting, to cast in front of you, you have to have line extending behind you as well. So if you're standing on a bank, you have brush, you have trees. If nothing else, you have rocks and things that can be going up the bank. Usually rivers are down in the lowest part. Water tends to find the lowest, easiest place to flow. So up on the banks are usually higher elevation. And if you have canopy and things like that around you, being in the river, there's nothing growing in the river. So you have kind of a lane that's clear for you to fly cast versus being on a bank without waders really is limiting your ability to cast.
That makes a lot of sense. And that's a good point. I think that, people don't really think about it, but if you're a bait fisher or spin traditional, you just launch that thing out there pointing forwards. But when you're fly casting, you actually have to cast backwards.
Yes.
If you're doing a traditional overhand cast, at least.
For sure.
So that's a big part of it. All right, well, let's keep moving on with this. I think we've covered a lot of stuff. It's been very educational. Thank you for that, Lance.
Thank you.
We've kind of talked about the technical side of fly fishing and versus regular fishing and even, what it means to actually fish. But I think that there's also like this whole other side of fly fishing that seems to be a vital part of it. It's definitely running deep in the veins of sport, which is more of like the philosophical side of fly fishing, conservation, and also just the culture of it. So I'm going to start with, a lot of people, when they think of fly fishers, they think of them as these very snobby, uptight people. I'm not going to get into like demographics or anything like that, but I think that traditionally it's been like a rich person's sport and for people that are kind of snobby. Do you or do you not agree with this? And do you think that any old random person, no matter where you're from, could get into the sport and find enjoyment in that?
Well, I think you can find snobby people in any sport. But I think in today's fly fishing world, if you have a tiny, tiny bit of disposable income, you could come from just about any demographic and get into fly fishing for sure. I can tell you from working in fly fishing stores and all tackle stores for like the last, I'm not really sure, maybe 25 or maybe a few more years than that, 25 or so years, that there are all types of people from, millionaires, billionaires, all the way down to people that are making minimum wage are all neck deep in fly fishing because it is that much fun.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think that's one of the things that I was dispelled when I started to get into it. I thought it was this kind of like elitist sort of thing. Once you start to talk to the community and the people that are actually into it, there's a whole new breed of people that are thinking differently about the sport and making it something that's like much more accessible. I mean, without going too far, Ray right here is an expert urban angler and helped me learn how to fish the harbors and in places where normally, when you think of fly fishing, you think of these beautiful meadows and stuff in Montana. And like, we're here doing fly fishing in kind of seedy places at times, I fished the LA River for carp and there was people doing heroin next to me, There's nothing classy about that. I think that it's changed. The culture is changing, and I think that it's much more open. There's a huge movement for women also to join the sport.
Hey, dude, you better believe it.
And there's been a lot of companies that are trying to get more people involved, and I think that a lot of women have found enjoyment in fly fishing. I know me personally, I got my sister into it, and she's obsessed with it. So it's one of those things where it's much more inviting, I think, than maybe it was in the past. And so if you are curious about fly fishing and you have had these doubts about it, I can guarantee you that it's not what you think it is if you thought it was this snobby kind of elitist sport.
No, it can be that if you want it to be. There's no reason to make it that way. There's game fish everywhere in the country, whether you're fishing for bass, for carp, you can catch catfish on a fly. Heck, I caught some suckers the other day.
I saw that on your Instagram.
Yeah, you can catch...
There's a big head.
Shad, you can catch salmon. I mean, everything. You can catch billfish in the ocean, tarpon in the ocean on fly tackle. So it's almost anywhere you live, you have access to some sort of game fish, and you can use fly tackle to catch them.
Yeah, it's a beautiful thing. Okay, so let's keep moving with this philosophy thing too. There's one thing that I still personally, as a fly fisher and someone who's been doing it for about 4 years now, I don't know if my perspective is just like so narrow, because I used to do a bit of spin fishing, but then once I got into fly fishing, I picked up a fly rod and I haven't not thought about it or fished pretty much, at least once a week for 4 years. It's just consumed my life. So what I've noticed is, and I'm so entrenched in this sport, so it's kind of hard for me to have a perspective, but I am curious to see what you think, and maybe Ray, you can chime from back there. But I know that these guys that are doing like bass fishing and they're so dialed. They know every season, they know what's spawning, they know what's the forage, they know all these things, the same things that we know, but it seems like the average fly fisher is way more tuned into the science of what's happening to catch fish. I think part of that is because we're not using worms or something that has scent where the fish come to you. You actually have to go to them to catch them. But I was curious to get your 2 cents on that.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it can be more intellectual, but I don't think it has to be. I mean, again, having worked with thousands and thousands of people over the years, I don't mean to put anybody down, but I'm definitely not the sharpest tool in the shed over here. But there's some people that are not putting a lot of thought into fly fishing for sure. There's also, they just love to do it, and they do it with very rough tackle and with really old school, basic flies, and they go out and they try and catch a fish, and they do it a time or two a year, and it's kind of their little outing, and that's fun. And I think the same applies to conventional gear, where there's people that just a few times a year go out or maybe not even that often, go out and drown a worm, throw some power bait, throw some lures, and see if they can catch something. And then there's the opposite of that, where a tournament bass angler, like you're saying, and walleye anglers are paying attention to barometric pressure and water temperature, and know hundreds of different rigging techniques and different knots and different lines. And the same with fly fishing, right? You could go out and we get old guys around here that are I've been doing this for longer than you've been alive, son. And
right.
And
I know that guy.
They take them ginger quills out to the creek and we catch our fish, and you're just like, all right, bro, that's cool. You as long as you love it, man, that's your gig. You got to love it.
Yeah.
But you also get people that are crazy into it, that want 10, 15, 20, 30 different fly rods that are technique specific, and you get some people that just want a 9 foot, 8 foot, whatever 5-weight rod to go cover as many bases as possible. So I think it can be really a thinker sport. It can also be really basic.
I agree with you. I was only asking because I feel like all the people I know that fly fish, they're a little bit more into the science side of it and kind of like really diving into that. But maybe again, I've just been lucky to be around really good anglers.
No, I think you're right though. I think most anglers, most people that are passionate fly fisher, if they're like Pablo, where they're not a day goes by that they're not thinking about something fly fishing, right? I can certainly relate to that for the last, 30, 35, 40 years. Nothing not a day has gone by without me thinking about fishing. But there's also those that, they think about it once or twice a year. But I think you're right in that to be successful at it, consistently successful at fly fishing and conventional fishing too, you have to kind of jump in with both feet and really dive in, dig in, and learn all you can about each of the species of fish you're chasing and what their habits are based on time of year and on and on. And we don't need to go into those rabbit holes, but to be successful consistently, you're going to have to take that leap. If it's something you're going to do 2 weekends a year, you're probably not worried about those little details.
Thanks for clearing that up, Lance. You're the best. Hard to get people to laugh in this room. A tough crowd here, ladies and gentlemen. Maybe my jokes just suck.
Yes.
All right, so we're going to start narrowing this down here, kind of closing up, but sticking with this philosophy theme. The one thing that I have noticed that has been such a big part of fly fishing, and people are constantly talking about it and seem much more conscious about it, is the conservation aspect and kind of protecting the species that you're chasing as well as the fishery that you're fishing. I feel like that's a big part of the fly fishing kind of ethos.
Yeah.
Maybe you want to talk a little bit about that. I think that that's an important aspect to the sport, and I think it's a positive that comes along with getting into the sport.
Yeah, that's a real positive. Again, it all boils down to the level at which the people are wanting to do this. Someone that's in a bass tournament, that's a tournament angler, or a walleye tournament angler, or somebody that's catching or releasing muskie that's putting in thousands of hours to just catch 1 or 2 fish, they're going to be all about conservation. Somebody that's going once a year, twice a year to the local stocked pond to catch a couple of hatchery mutants to take home and freezer burn, they're less likely to be concerned about conservation, right? Fly fishers, generally speaking, are, I think, really into conservation because they recognize that we need to have sustainable fisheries, and we need to have, make things at least as good and hopefully better for our kids and for the next generation to be able to experience the things that we love to experience. So it definitely, with fly fishing, conservation goes hand in hand. I don't think that's unique to fly fishing. It's more unique to dedicated anglers, regardless of the discipline.
Okay, I'm actually, there's tears running down my face right now because that was so beautiful.
Right.
I think you're right about that. I have such a narrow window on this stuff. I mean, there's a place that I fish in Indiana that's about an hour away. We'll not disclose the location, but it holds some big steelhead, and behind those guys, there's a bunch of suckers. I've noticed that when I go there, a lot of times you'll find dead suckers all over the place. My guess is that there's someone or multiple people that are catching these suckers and like, oh, that's not a steelhead, and then just throw them on the bank and let them die.
Right.
And it hurts my feelings because I personally, I like all fish. A friend of ours, a good friend of ours, Ike, he's like a carp guide here in the area, but he always says they're all special. And that's exactly how I feel too, because they are all special. And so I don't know if it's just fly centric or not. But I think that, protecting these fish and also just, not being so brute with them is something that should be shared in all disciplines of fishing. I remember one year I was in Hilton Head. There were some guys catching little baby sharks off the beach, which is something I used to enjoy doing when I was doing just traditional fishing. But there was a guy that took this baby shark and he launched it in the air like 40 feet. To put it back. Mm-hmm. And I was just like, why are you doing this? What is the point of this? Like, it was insane. And it actually made me upset. I don't understand why is that fun?
I think a lot of times people don't recognize how important each species of fish is to the river ecosystem, if you will, the health of each fishery. There are native fish in many of our waters that have been there for eons that are supposed to be there. And a lot of times, like in my neck of the woods, whitefish they're a native salmonid. So they're a cousin to the trout, right? They take flies well. They fight really well. They're not as beautiful as trout. They have a subterminal mouth rather than a larger mouth like a trout. They don't have a mouth like a sucker, but somewhere between a sucker and a trout. But
what'd you say about my mom?
I didn't say anything about your mother.
Oh.
Subterminal
mouth.
The whitefish have a adipose fin, just like trout. And they're found in many of our larger waterways. Anyway, long story short, a lot of people don't respect them because they don't like them as much as trout.
Can't get any respect around here.
And they are under the not true belief that whitefish are detrimental to a trout fishery, when in reality they're by design they were in fisheries at the same time trout were. They're designed to coexist. So whitefish they fill a role. Whitefish produce eggs, which trout eat their eggs. Whitefish produce minnows, which trout eat their minnows. All the way up to probably 7 or 8 inches long, trout will eat a little whitefish minnow. So if you eliminate whitefish from a fishery that's supposed to have them, a lot of times what's left for trout to eat is tiny little midges and little baetis and really small stuff, which tends to then shrink the size of your trout.
Make them small, yeah.
Where if you have a good, forage fish like a whitefish for trout to eat, they can reach bigger sizes. So a lot of fisheries that are designed to whether that's suckers, whether that's whitefish, whether that's whatever. If it's a non-native invasive species, that's probably a different story. But you have to kind of work with your local wildlife resources, the agencies that are managing your fisheries, and learn a little bit about which species are supposed to be there, which are not, which are helping, which are detrimental. And generally speaking, if they don't have a bounty or some sort of open limit on the species, then you probably ought to treat them with care and respect them. And like you're saying, even if it's not what your target species. Again, like I was saying earlier in the podcast, I caught some suckers the other day. I wasn't targeting suckers. I was targeting rainbows and cutthroats, but I caught a few.
Those suckers are suckers, man.
They are suckers. I didn't want to catch them necessarily. I wasn't trying to catch them, but I did. They fought well. They took a fly well, and I carefully released them back because they're native to that particular, I was in a reservoir, but they're native to that drainage. And so there's no reason to throw them on the bank. They're not overtaking the lake. They're not hurting the other species. They're just supposed to be there.
They also can teach you about what you're doing. You're catching suckers, they're on the bottom of the river. That means that what you were throwing at them was getting a drift that was very low. I'm assuming you're the expert, but
correct.
There's things that will be learned from those things.
For
also.
Sure. Yeah, and they're only going to eat what's available. So if you're eating the same things that trout and other species are eating, then you're kind of on the right path, right?
Yeah, exactly. Ray wants to speak.
Speak, Ray.
So you mentioned you let it go carefully. And I think in fly fishing, you have the whole keep them wet movement and the proper care of fish. And that's something you see a lot more in the world of fly fishing, I think, than you do in conventional. It's kind of like, you mentioned toss the fish back in the water versus, hey, we're going to make sure that we properly, handle the fish while we have it and also release the fish in a respectful way.
Sure.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's another aspect of it I think that is really cool. Putting back the fish in the water so that it can live another day so someone else can catch that beautiful thing too.
Yeah, you want to treat them with respect and be careful with them, right?
We're pretty much at the end of this whole thing, but I do have one final question that might ruffle your hackle. Ew.
I don't have very much hackle left, Pablo.
I think hackle's supposed to be on the neck of an animal, according to the
I shaved my neck
Merriam-Webster.
At least 2 or 3 weeks ago. I shaved my neck, so I think we're all right.
Oh, okay, fair.
Pisces, berries, boom.
Hackle, noun. Hackle is a technical term meaning erectile plumage or hair in the neck area of some birds and mammals. Yeah, sketchy. Example in context. That fish smoked my fly and it's making my hackle stand up.
No.
But so for all of our listeners that are noobs, there's a very specific style of fishing that we had talked about earlier that was called European style fishing, Euro nymphing as they call it here. And there's kind of some, old traditionalists that are kind of hate on it a bit. So I wanted to ask Lance, who's basically like the nation's poster child for it, is Euro nymphing the same as spin fishing? Because ultimately you're using the weight of the beads to get the fly out there and not the fly line. Especially if you decide to do it not comp style, which, for a while there, I was fishing just like 30 feet of 6X tippet. And I was like, am I even fly fishing at this point?
Right. Who knows? That's for you to decide. I still call it fly fishing because I'm using a fly rod. I am using a fly line. I'm using flies. So I call it fly fishing, but you can, I guess I've been asked that question before, and I always tell people you can call it whatever you want because I don't care.
Right.
Like I said,
answer.
I ice fish. I throw bait casters. I'm not only a fly fisher, so I'm just fishing one way or another. Fly fishing happens to be my favorite way to do it. I actually spend probably less time Euro nymphing than I do almost anything else anymore. For a while, I did it a lot to try and learn it, but I'm one that likes to really mix it up. I don't like to do the same things over and over. So if I nymph tomorrow, then when I go out early next week, I would probably throw streamers or throw dries if I could, or fish a lake instead of a river. I'm always mixing it up. But fly fishing is whatever you want it to be. The definition in the dictionary gives you fly rod, fly reel, fly line, and flies. So I'm checking all those boxes with Euro nymphing the way I'm setting up. So yes, I would call it fly fishing.
All right, fair enough. You heard it here, kids. You probably heard it on another podcast he did like 2 months ago, but that's okay. All right, so we're going to wrap this up now. I think we've done a pretty good job of kind of explaining what is fishing, why fly fish instead of gear fish, and kind of what defines the sport in action and in philosophy. Like I said, we're taking you from zero to hero here. So we've covered why we're going to do this. Next episode, we're going to talk about how we do it. Really, we're going to talk about the equipment. It'll be reels, rods, lines, weights, leader, tippet, the whole shebang. So stick around. You'll have a good clue in on what rod you should get and what line you should use depending on whatever you're chasing. And it'll be a good way to kind of wet your feet, pun intended, on the gear side of this sport. This is the Noob and the Knower. My name is Pablo Signori, and I got Lance here.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
All right, we got Ray here, keeping it live and real on the ones and twos.
What up? Peace.
And we'll be back with another episode covering gear. Thanks so much, guys. The Noob and the Knower, Season 1, Episode 1, What is Fishing?
This was a Raul Maria production.
I might have to take my top off. Hold on.
Can you turn off Zoom? I don't want to see it.